shall get started. So, yes, hi, I am Janine Marriott. I'm the Public Engagement Manager at Arnos Vale Cemetery in Bristol. I notice there's quite a number of Bristol people saying hi in the chat, so hi to all you guys. Hopefully all of you, or at least most of you, have been to Arnos Vale because it's amazing and beautiful. So I'm going to talk about a bit about Arnos Vale, about the story of the Arnos Vale, how it started and where we are at the moment, and I'm going to throw you in some interesting stories because I know everybody loves a bit of you know, murder, mystery and mayhem on a Monday afternoon evening. So I'm going to throw those in, but I'm really happy to answer questions at the end. And I noticed that one of my tour guides is definitely in this talk, so if not, he might be able to answer the question if I can't. So a little bit about Arnos Vale. So Arnos Vale was built in 1839. It's the first great cemetery in the southwest. It was originally 32 acres when it was first started, but it's now 45 acres. It's absolutely massive. I thought I would throw in just a little bit of the timeline of 19th century Georgian Victorian cemeteries, just so you can see where Arnos Vale fits in this kind of timeline of the big Victorian style cemeteries. This is actually from Lindsay Keniston's research, Lindsay Udall's research, and I think she's here, so thanks Lindsay. If you look, we are on the third line down, Arnos Vale, just after Highgate, or same year as Highgate, and Nunhead, but just before Tower Hamlets, so it's slightly younger than Tower Hamlets. So Arnos Vale, like a number of historic cemeteries in the UK, was set up as a business. It was set up as a business because basically we needed the space. We were running out. So it was set up as what we call a joint stock cemetery. So what happened is a group of gentlemen basically set up a shareholding company to build a cemetery on what was the outskirts of Bristol at that point. It was the countryside. They bought a beautiful historic landscape, which actually was a local beauty spot already, and they built a cemetery within that space, and that was very much in the tradition of the historic cemetery. So these cemeteries, from the people who advised on how to design these cemeteries, Loudon being the most famous one, they suggested these beautiful sweeping landscapes. So Arnos Vale is in a sort of a perfect position for this. So what I've got here in front of you right now is one of our postcard, well, a calling card of an undertaker's, Ware and Sons, and they actually have shown Arnos Vale there in the background. I'm going to tell you a little bit about those two buildings a bit later on in my talk. But Arnos Vale was a garden cemetery, so it was planted deliberately with beautiful trees like weeping willows, yews, all that kind of thing to make it a beautiful space to be in. And that was kind of the idea of these historic cemeteries, is that people would not just, you know, have a lovely place for their loved ones to rest in perpetuity, unlike the city graveyards, which were frankly full. They were disgusting. They were an unpleasant place to be. This was meant to be a beautiful place. The reason the city graveyards were so full is because Bristol had gone from a small medieval town. In the Industrial Revolution, it expanded massively, about 3 times its original size. So that means 3 times the people, 3 times the waste, and also obviously 3 times the bodies. So they didn't have enough space to bury people, basically, in the city graveyards, and they were full. There is a legend that if you were not a resident of Bristol and you crossed over Bristol Bridge, you would faint from the smell of the city. It was that disgusting. So the Arnos Vale was a real literal breath of fresh air. And as you can see, it was obviously quite an impressive place, and people would want their loved ones to be buried there, and that's why they've got this trade card. Okay, so this is an aerial photograph. It's not, unfortunately, a particularly recent one, but I don't know if you'll be able to see my cursor, but this area here is pretty much all Arnos Vale. As you can see, it's a very, very green, very, very lush cemetery. This is the ceremonial way, just here, and these are our 2 gate lodges and our 2 chapels. We've got 2 chapels, 2 separate chapels, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our chapels because we have 4 listed buildings on site. Our 2 historic chapels and our 2 gate lodges. All of our buildings are in the ancient Greek style. So they're obviously not ancient Greek buildings. They're definitely designed in the Victorian period. They were designed by an architect called Charles Underwood, who was actually buried just on the hill behind this building here. He obviously loved it very much. But Charles Underwood built, designed the whole landscape in the style of a garden cemetery. He put these beautiful ancient Greek style buildings on site. And the reason they're not churches, they're chapels, is because this was very much set up as a business. It was always a business. So it was a business with shareholders, and they didn't want it, it wasn't attached to any particular faith. It was partly blessed by the Anglican bishop, but it wasn't any particular faith. It was not attached to any church. So their buildings didn't need to look like churches, so they chose ancient Greek temples. So the one that you can see on your left is the Anglican chapel, which is in the Corinthian style. And you can see the bell tower on the top, which looks like a teeny tiny chapel all of its own. And actually, from a distance, that looks like it's up on the hill because Arnos Vale's in like a bowl shape. So it's deliberately designed to look like it's sort of a little chapel in the distance, like an ancient, like a romantic Greek landscape. So that's the Corinthian style. And on the right-hand side here, we have the Ionic style. People can remember that by the little scrolls on the top of the columns. They look like eyes, so I for Ionic. So this is the Ionic style of an ancient Greek temple with those lovely columns. The building that you can see to the right of it obviously isn't Victorian. That is our a cafe space, which is attached to the side. Now it looks very, very modern, but that's deliberate. That building could, if we wanted to, be completely removed and wouldn't leave a trace on the building, apart from the door we had to put through. But it basically makes what was a very inaccessible Victorian building into an extremely accessible building. So there's a ramp going up to it. There's a lift down into the basement to go to the loos. There is a flat surface. So that means that this building can now be used for all sorts of things. We hold yoga in there, choir concerts, all sorts of fascinating things, kids clubs. So it's a really usable space. And also obviously it's glass. So the new extension on the outside, so when you're inside, you can look out on the beautiful vistas, and that's part of the idea of a Victorian cemetery, is looking out on the vistas. It's the views. And our other two grade 2 star listed buildings on site are our two lodge buildings, which are in the oldest style of classical architecture, the ancient Greek style of the Doric. And they are identical to each other. They face each other and they look almost identical. Their windows are very slightly different. So they greet you as you come in through our main gates. And as you can see, this site is absolutely filled with graves. Probably got 350,000 people buried at Arnos Vale. We've not really done an absolute tally. Buried, all their scattered ashes remains scattered or buried on the site. So huge numbers of people remembered here at Arnos Vale. And as you can see, it's a very well used and very well worn site. So you can see that path going down into the cemetery. So it's a place that people visit and enjoy and explore and use a lot. And it's free to enter, like Tower Hamlets. So that's the buildings. Now I thought I would go on to some people for you. So this is probably our most famous resident. This is Raja Ramamohan Roy. Raja Ramamohan Roy was actually someone who died before Arnos Vale started. So he's one of our, what we call our time traveling graves. So he actually died in 1833, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life first. I could actually just tell you about his life. He's such an interesting person. But this is a portrait that hangs in the gallery in Bristol, and this is the Raja in sort of a Muslim style dress. He was actually a Hindu, but he called himself a Unitarian Hindu. That's because he was a real religious thinker, and he thought a lot of different paths could lead to God. He had a really strong connection to the Unitarian Church in the UK, and he actually started up his own branch of Hinduism called Brahmo Samaj. He himself was born in a very wealthy family. He was a high-class Brahmin, so he could have lived an absolute life of luxury, just took his ease, but he didn't. He learned about at least 8 different languages. He was a religious thinker. He wrote pamphlets. He wrote information for people about God. He wrote protest information. He set up his own free press. And this, don't forget, this time in India, the whole country was part of the British Empire, but basically ruled by the East India Company. He fought for children's rights, and he set up schools for poor children. He fought for women's rights as well. He particularly helped to stop, or tried to help stop, a practice called sati. Now, sorry if this is a bit much for a Monday evening, but sati is the practice where when a Hindu husband dies, he is cremated, and his wife is expected to self-immolate, which basically means she's expected to throw herself onto his funeral pyre at this point in history. It had been made illegal by the East India Company, but there were moves to try and kind of overturn that. And he had witnessed it himself. He thought it was an appalling practice, absolutely barbaric, and it should definitely be stopped. So he actually petitioned the government to make sure that this ruling, this ban, stayed in place. He wasn't born a Raja. He was given the title of Raja by the Mughal Emperor in 1830, so that he could become an ambassador to the Mughal Emperor. However, the East India Company did not recognize this honorific. But luckily for him, other people did. So he actually came to the UK to do lots of different things, speak to the government, do this petition, came to meet friends he'd been corresponding with, religious thinkers he'd been corresponding with, all sorts of things. But he also managed to go to the coronation of William IV, and he was presented to the court of King Louis Philippe. So he was a really important person. He was highly respected in his own country and respected in other people's countries. Unfortunately, on his world tour, he turned up in London, spoke to the government, attended lots of a huge social whirl, being introduced here, there and everywhere, and caught meningitis. He probably did catch his meningitis in London. He then went to Bristol, where he became extremely ill. He did do some functions, but then he became extremely ill, and he actually died in the house that he was living in, the house friends he was staying in Stapleton Grove in Bristol. Now, there's a bit of an issue in Georgian Britain with what on earth do you do with a dead Hindu, because obviously he should have been cremated as a Hindu. Cremation wasn't legal. He couldn't be buried in a graveyard because they were Christian, so he couldn't be buried there. So in the end, they came up with the solution that he was buried in the back garden of the house where he died, which is all very well, but he was such a famous and important and brilliant person that people wanted to constantly come and visit his grave and pay their respects. So his friend Dwarkanath Tagore decided that where the Raja was buried wasn't appropriate to his standing. So he decided that he needed a better place, and Arnos Vale opened up. Now, Arnos Vale, as I said, is not related to any particular faith. It is half blessed by the Anglican Church, but half of it is not consecrated at all. So it meant that this wonderful chhatri could be put up for him. So his friend Dwarkanath funded and got his other friend William Princeps to design this memorial. So it's a British architect, but it has got Indian influences. Obviously, you can see this beautiful rounded top on it. It's actually got a pinnacle on the very top, which is a lotus flower, and that lotus flower represents reincarnation in the Hindu faith. It's got these lovely columns, but it's also got little marigolds on those columns, which you can't see from this distance, but if you're up close, you can see that they're carved marigolds, and that would be something you laid on a body. So the Raja was disinterred from his burial place in 1844 and reburied in Arnos Vale. So he actually died before it existed, but he's a fascinating person, and if you feel like going and have a look at the information about his life, you should. We remember him even today because he was so important in the history of India and the history of Hinduism and the history of modern India. He's regarded as one of the fathers or founders of modern India. He gets constantly visited. And on the closest date or Sunday to his death, 27th of September normally, we usually have a celebration of his life and his work and his influence. Obviously, we didn't do that this year because we usually get over 100 people attending that. And we have prayers and songs and dances and all sorts of things to remember the Raja. So he's probably our most internationally famous person. Okay, move on to someone a bit different. So this is Thomas Gad Matthews. Thomas Gad Matthews was one of the shareholders in the Bristol General Cemetery Company, as was. And he was one of the people who helped invest in the cemetery and create it. And I do wonder whether one of the reasons that he did this is because he had a problem. He had a thing he had to solve. And his issue was that he was an Anglican. So he was a Church of England, but his wife Mary, now if you can see Thomas Gad Matthews, second line down, wife Mary is 4 lines down. His wife Mary was a Congregationalist, so a nonconformist. So according to each of their own faiths, they didn't want to be buried in each other's areas. So he obviously wanted to be buried in consecrated ground in the Anglican area. She wanted to be buried in the non-consecrated ground by the tenets of her own faith. So what he did, he came up with a solution. He knew, being the shareholder, he knew the place where the divide was, where the blessing divide was, and he bought a plot that straddled the area so that he could be buried in his half of the cemetery in this enormous plot, the largest plot in the cemetery, and she could be buried in her half. So they're both in their own faith areas, but they are still romantically together in their grave, which I think is really rather sweet. And this grave is grade 2 star listed because it's just so beautiful and it's got such a great story. But because they're slightly different faiths, it hasn't got any religious symbolism, but it's got a huge amount of symbolism if you look carefully. So if we've got, first of all, to reflect the fact he's one of the shareholders, we've got the scrolls on the side, which kind of reflect those scrolls on the chapel that I showed you. Acanthus leaves growing up the side, which is an ancient Greek symbol, and you see those on Corinthian buildings. We've got open roses, which represent a married woman. We've got sweet peas, which represent the sweetness of love. We've got lilies, which are obviously the flower of death. And above those scrolls, you can just see ivy carved in. Ivy represents everlasting love because you can't get rid of it. And then right on the top, we've got this chest tomb. There is no one in there. I'd just like to make that really clear. Some people think that it might be somebody buried up there, but they're not. That's just for show. And on the very, very top of that chest tomb, we've actually got a scallop shell. And scallop shells were what Romans were often had on their coffins when they were buried. So this family want you to know that they're wealthy and that they've got money and that they're knowledgeable. Gad Matthews, as well as being a shareholder in the cemetery, also made a lot of his money in indigo. He was an indigo importer, and he actually brought indigo back to dye uniforms during the Crimean War. So he made his money from dyeing uniforms. So that's where a lot of his cash for this amazingly large, beautiful monument came from. Something a bit darker now. This is William Herapath. This lovely smiley chap on the left is William Herapath, and that's his grave on the right. And if you were closer, you would be able to read that it says Professor of Chemistry, and he was a well-known Professor of Chemistry during the Georgian and Victorian period. And because of this, he was asked to help solve a possible murder. So the lady in the middle is a lady called Mrs. Burdock. Now, what happened is an older lady called Clara Ann had suddenly dropped dead in a lodging house in Bristol. Mary Burdock, who was her landlady, couldn't explain where any of her money had gone, any of Clara's money had gone, or any of her possessions. People were a bit suspicious. Her nephew in particular was suspicious. So she was buried in St. Augustine's churchyard, but 18 months later, she was disinterred. And that's because of the work of William Herapath, partly. Now, this may be the first example of forensic science in the whole of the UK. He had been doing some experiments to prove what happened to bodies when they were poisoned. And he'd done a lot of experiments, and he realized that certain things happen to the human body, and unfortunately other mammals, when you experimented on them. So they disinterred Clara, and he looked inside her stomach, and he found arsenic crystals. Now, it's possible that she could have taken those herself. Arsenic was extremely easy in the Victorian period to get hold of. You would literally just pop down to the shop and go down to the pharmacy, say to the person at the counter at Boots, I'd like to buy some arsenic, please. And they'd say, well, what's it for? Or you could say, oh, it's for poisoning the rats in my basement, or it's for cleaning. It was used in a huge amount of things. So, of course, the evidence of the arsenic in the stomach, they went to the local pharmacy, and lo and behold, she had bought the poison. So Mrs. Burdock had bought that poison. She denied the fact that she'd poisoned Clara. She said it was obviously an accident, but they didn't believe her. They decided that she'd murdered Clara and that she was going to be hanged for her crimes. So she went to the prison, and she didn't admit to the murder until the very last night that she was going to be hanged. So the night before she was going to be hanged, she asked for her coffin to be brought into the cell so she might get used to it, which is pretty unusual. And then she admitted to it and said she was pleased that she was being done for murder and not for theft, because if she wasn't done for theft, then her family could keep the money and her children could have the money, which was probably Clara's and should have gone to Clara's family. So then she was hanged, and she was then buried in the prison grave, in the prison grounds. So she's not at Arnos Vale. However, after she was hanged, somebody came forward and said that he was her husband. A gentleman called Mr. Agar came forward and said, she was my wife. She left me and ran off. So actually, it turns out she had had 2 further bigamous marriages, and her children were not entitled to any of that money. So Mr. Agar walked off with the entire fortune, which in today's money, apparently, we would be about £600,000. So pretty impressive. And what was interesting about Clara Ann is she was, as I said, put back into the St. Augustine's churchyard, but during the later 19th century, that churchyard was cleared, and a lot of the bodies were then brought to Arnos Vale. And so probably she's ended up buried at Arnos Vale somewhere in one of the common interments. So that's pretty unusual. He was also involved in probably what's one of the earliest examples of an anaesthetic operation, but I can't tell you about that today because I haven't got the time. But here's another interesting story. Oh, Bristol, pretty dangerous place, clearly. This is the grave of PC Richard Hill. PC Richard Hill, as you can see from the plaque on the left, was a police constable. And he was murdered whilst in the execution of his duty. What happened is PC Hill was in Old Market, and if you know Old Market, you know there's a lot of pubs in Old Market. And a gentleman called William Pullin was drunk and in charge of a donkey, and he was beating the donkey. So a baker came out to remonstrate with him, and him and the baker got into a fight. PC Hill heard about the fight, went running to try and break it up, because he was a police officer, and unfortunately William Pullin pulled a knife on him and stabbed him, but stabbed him in the knee, so probably didn't mean to kill him. Unfortunately hit a major artery, and by the time they'd got a cart to take him to the hospital, PC Hill had bled out. PC Hill was due to be married in a few weeks, and so his almost widow was obviously absolutely devastated, and also unlikely that she'd be able to get a new marriage, being so close to her marriage date. So the people of Bristol got together and got her a pension so that she would get a widow's pension from his death, even though they weren't quite married. William Pullin was caught and he was sentenced to be hanged. But because he was only 19 and because he'd been led astray by drink, 7,000 people petitioned the powers that be and said he shouldn't be hanged. He's too young. He didn't mean to do it. So his sentence was commuted, and he was actually sentenced to 20 years hard labour, which he survived. He then came back to Bristol, and he actually became a wealthy landlord, and his great-great-grandniece found out about this story and had PC Hill's memorial restored. So you can see it's all clean and tidy there. So it all goes around, but poor PC Hill murdered in the execution of his duty. So said Bristol was a pretty dangerous place. I'm going to go a little bit further on, talk about William Budd. He's another one of our fantastic people. A lot of people have probably heard of Jon Snow. So he's Bristol's Jon Snow, not from Game of Thrones, from the water. So Dr. Budd. Dr. Budd was a doctor. He was actually a family medical doctor, but his real interest was waterborne disease, because he didn't believe in miasma theory, or not entirely. There was a theory in the Victorian period, which is the prevailing medical theory, that if you sniffed a nasty smell, you caught a disease from dirty, miasmic, filthy air. Now, he'd had typhoid in his life, and he was fairly sure that some diseases could be transported by water. So he started researching cholera. He moved to Bristol, started researching cholera. Bristol had a number of really awful outbreaks of cholera. The cholera had come over on the tea clippers, probably to Bristol, got into the water system, which was, the sewage system was a disaster. The water system wasn't much better, still a medieval system. And cholera just ran rampant around Bristol, killing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in its first round around Bristol. Budd noticed that all the people who caught cholera all had something in common. They were all drinking the same water. So he started plotting it on a map. And this is the map from the British Medical Journal that he presented as part of his research. And as you can see, it's not very clear, but you can see a little red cluster on one of these pictures. They were all drinking the same water. So he proved that they were all catching it from the water. So he put in really simple suggestions to the health inspectors and said, if people have got cholera in their street, they shouldn't drink the same water supply. They find it from somewhere else. They should boil their water. They shouldn't wash their hands in the same water that the dirty clothes of the person who has cholera has got. Things that we think are obvious today, but this is before germ theory. So he was really an interesting thinker, and he was way ahead of his time. And basically, by the time the last cholera outbreak happened, he really made a big change, and lots less people died. He also helped improve the sewerage and the water systems by basically setting up a company which put in better sewerage, better water systems, built water towers, so it supplied fresh, clean, healthy water to the whole of Bristol. So he really improved the city. So he was a fascinating chap, and interestingly, he was at the funeral of Dr. Herapath. So little weird for cemetery fact, and that's his very boring, very plain grave at the top left there. Thought I'd move a little bit further on in history now. This is some of our war graves. Now I must make sure I get exactly the right numbers here. We have over 350 war dead buried here at Arnos Vale, and an awful lot of them are in our World War I plot. So this is the plot you see on the left in your picture. There's 240 people buried there. It's a bit hard to believe because there's not that many stones, but many of those stones are shared by 3 or 4 people, and there's a number of stones that are missing now. So this is our World War I screen wall, and in front of that screen wall with the arches is a whole load of burials of service personnel. They were all brought to Bristol for treatment for diseases and injuries, and the Bristol hospitals in the First World War were excellent, but obviously without antibiotics there were certain things that they just couldn't cure. So we have people from the UK, we have Australians, we have Canadians, we have people from Newfoundland, which was a separate country at that point, and we also interestingly have 3 South Africans buried at Arnos Vale. 2 of those South Africans are actually black South Africans. They were Zulus. We don't know a huge amount to do about them because unfortunately there's no records that survive, and also their names aren't correctly spelled on the memorial, unsurprisingly. But what's really interesting about it is one of the black South Africans and one of the white South Africans are buried together in the same plot, which would never have happened in the First World War period in a grave. If they'd been back in South Africa, they would have been kept separate. So we've no idea why they went in the same grave, but they did, and that's absolutely fascinating. We also have Victoria cross holder, which is the grave at the very front, which again I haven't got time to tell you about, but he's a fascinating chap as well. On the right, we've got our Sailors' Corner, which is some of our Second World War personnel, who are almost all people who died at sea or were working on the ships and brought back. They're almost all Commonwealth graves, except for one person who is Polish, and he has a very slightly different grave. So if you ever come, you'll be able to spot who he is. He's got a pointed top rather than a rounded top. And Arnos Vale also has, in another place, several different Norwegian service personnel who are really important in keeping the supply lines open to the UK in the Second World War. So we've got loads and loads of war dead, probably one of the largest non-military war memorial probably the largest non-military war graves in the southwest, and maybe even in the UK, excluding Brookwood. So we've got a large number of people, and we do Armistice Day ceremonies at Arnos Vale every year. Obviously, again this year ours was virtual, but we always remember those people. In fact, the first Armistice Day ceremony at Arnos Vale was in 1921, so very early. So I thought I'd bring up today, Arnos Vale is, as well as being a historic cemetery, still a working cemetery, and we still bury. So this is the absolutely amazing Carmen Beckford. She's a lady on the left in the picture. So she, as you can see, she had an MBE. She was one of the Windrush generation. She turned up in Bristol in the 1930s, and she was nicknamed the Carnival Queen. She lived in an area of Bristol called St Paul's, and she wanted to improve the way that the people of St Paul's lived and the attitudes of everyone in Bristol to the people of St Paul's. So she helped set up St Paul's Carnival, which still goes today. It's a very popular event. If you ever want to come down, it's absolutely amazing. It's, as you can see from the picture, it's brilliant floats, a bit like Notting Hill, not quite so big, pretty impressive. Carmen was the first community development officer in the Bristol City Council, and she did substantial amounts of work improving race relations in the city of Bristol. She was friends with some of the other with 7 other people, particularly with 6 other people. They're called the 7 Saints of St Paul's. So Carmen Beckford was one of those Saints of St Paul's. She worked alongside a chap called Paul Stevenson, who was the chap who led the Bristol bus boycott. So if you've not heard of the Bristol bus boycott, it's worth looking that up, because that's absolutely fascinating piece of Bristol history. And they all have their own mural in St Paul's that you can go on a walking tour and follow. And so she's remembered at Arnos Vale because, as I said, we're still a working cemetery, and she gets regular visits from all sorts of people, and her funeral was an absolute celebration of life. So really quickly, before I stop, I'm going to quickly tell you about things we do at Arnos Vale. Arnos Vale still, as I said, a working cemetery, but also a heritage space. So we do tours. So I've got Alan doing a tour on the left-hand side there. That's a day tour. And then Charlotte doing a tour on the right-hand side, which is one of our night tours. We have theatre performances, poetry readings, film screenings, talks about Victorian cemeteries, nighttime film showings, in the indoors and outdoors, all sorts of things going on, school visits, and also we encourage a lot of volunteering. So this is some of our lovely volunteers are building a stone wall. And on the left and on the right, some student volunteers turning a piece of waste ground, which was a common interment, so a group grave, as it were, into a beautiful community garden. So our site is a real living, breathing, interesting place to be, full of stories, but absolutely full of people and full of life. So I'm going to stop talking now, because I've been talking for long enough, and I am going to share some of our links in the chat, if that's helpful to you, and then you can follow us. You can check out our website, you can follow us on Twitter, you can go to our Facebook page, follow us there. We've got an Instagram, or if you ever want to ask me any questions, that's my email address. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's me, because I also am doing a PhD in public engagement in cemeteries, and I have a blog as well, which I sometimes update. So, you know, don't get too hopeful. But if you want to follow any of those links on social media, please do. And now hopefully somebody will ask me questions. That'd be lovely. Thank you.